All right. I am joined now by Gene Bajalan and Daniel Bessner, both of whom know much more about the stuff that I do. So this is convenient since I've been having tons of back pain the last couple of days. So I substitute out the chair at the desk. So I'm going to try to lean into it for most of this. So I'll be able to do that much more easily if Gene and Danny are talking more than I am. And Daniel is fine. He assures me that a puppy did that. He wasn't attacked by a human being or anything. Of course we wanted to do this. And yeah, I'll also plead back problems in bed all day for my possibly even more ridiculously disheveled appearance than usual. So yeah, I think that a good place to start this off. Wanted to do this the stream because couldn't really fit it into to a regular episode, but it seemed like with what's been going on lately with Armenia and Azerbaijan, this would be a good. This is something that we should cover. And I just read this afternoon Gene's article about it in Jacobin. So I was wondering, Gene, if you could start us off. We don't necessarily have to go back to the first century BC or anything, but we could. Sure. But maybe we could start off with World War I, the Russian Revolution, and get a little bit of the background here.
Sure. Well, thanks for having us on, Ben, and I hope you feel better with your back.
Thanks.
It can't be much fun. Well, yeah, I mean, if we look at the Caucasus region, it was a region that was colonized by Russia in the 19th century, and it's a diverse region with many different populations, including Azerbaijani Turks and Armenians. And of course, as in many mountainous regions, these populations live in an interspersed manner. And one of the outcomes of sort of Russian colonial rule was, of course, the exploitation of differences between these communities, which, of course, heightened tensions between the various, the Muslim Azerbaijani Turks and the Armenians and other communities in the region. And, of course, at the same time, you have the rise of nationalism, which, again, also sort of adds further flames to tensions within this region. So these people had I wouldn't say lived in perfect harmony in a kind of bucolic paradise beforehand, but had lived alongside each other for centuries. But of course, in this new situation, you have growing tensions. And the Tsarist regime manages to keep these under control. But as the Tsarist regime sort of collapses, the lid of all these tensions come up. And we see in 1905, the first serious clashes between Azerbaijani Turks and Armenians. And then this is repeated in the aftermath of the First World War, which was particularly devastating to the Armenians, because although this is not directly connected, but during this First World War, you had the genocide of Armenians in Anatolia, which was a culturally and historically very important region for Armenians. And, this sort of creates the kind of existential crisis amongst Armenian nationalists. So many of the conflicts with Azerbaijani Turks take place within the framework of, the Armenians look at this as another attempt at genocide. In the 1920s, the Soviets come in, the region is rearranged. The brief independence of Armenia and Azerbaijan, which had come about following the 1917 revolution, is reversed, and these two countries are integrated into the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union attempts to solve the national question, and one of the ways they do it is by creating these autonomous fraternal republics. But of course, because the Caucasus is a very mixed region, it's difficult to draw lines about where people live. So you have this district called Karabakh, or Nagorno-Karabakh, which is the mountainous Karabakh. So Karabakh is a little bit bigger. It includes the lowlands. But when we talk about Nagorno-Karabakh, we're talking about the highlands of this broader Karabakh region, which is predominantly Armenian. And, the people there want to be part of the Armenian Republic, but the Soviet Union decides, for a variety of different reasons, to put them in the Azerbaijani Republic, and they have an autonomous status within that republic, there's a whole load of things that happens. There's an attempt at a Soviet Transcaucasian Federation that kind of ends in the late 1920s, and basically, the Soviet rule keeps these tensions under wraps, but also it institutionalizes ethnic differences. And at the same time, there was a growing tension between Armenians and Azerbaijanis, especially because, the Azerbaijani government, even though granting, having this autonomy for Nagorno-Karabakh, is kind of neglecting the Armenian population. And these come to attention at the end of, as the Soviet Union's collapsing. And, Nagorno-Karabakh's autonomous administration requests independence and attachment to Armenia. The Azeris react by removing their autonomy, and this leads to an escalating sort of cycle of violence, which sees massacres of both Armenians and Azeris, because again, these populations are interspersed with one another. And when the Soviet Union collapses, Nagorno-Karabakh declares independence. Armenia goes to war with Azerbaijan. We have this really bloody war with a lot of ethnic cleansing. The Armenians win, and ethnically cleanse over 500,000 Azerbaijanis from the surrounding districts from Nagorno-Karabakh. Armenians are ethnically cleansed from Azerbaijan, and then in 1994, Russia steps in, and there's a ceasefire. And there's been, since that ceasefire, kind of Cold War that is, there's been border clashes every couple of years. 2016, there was a pretty bad war in April, the 4-year, a big battle in the front. But more or less, this conflict has been frozen, and attempts to sort of solve the issue long term between the two sides have ultimately failed. And there's, blame to go around on both sides. Armenia and Azerbaijan have, for different reasons, at times undermined the peace process. So no one comes away from this particularly clean. So, of course, this latest round of violence is a new escalation in this long-running saga that has sort of been going on since the end of the Soviet Union.
So what happened this time? Like why is it flaring up now?
I mean, my perception is that there was actually some clashes earlier this summer, and Haydar Aliyev, the president of Azerbaijan. I mean, there's short-term and long-term factors. The long-term factor is that Azerbaijan has been getting richer and has been with its oil wealth. The balance of power has been shifting militarily more and more towards Azerbaijan. So, the Azerbaijanis increasingly look towards a military solution to this unfavorable status quo to them. But at the same time, the shorter-term reasons are that Haydar Aliyev, Ilham Aliyev, the president of Azerbaijan, is under criticism for the growing corruption within Azerbaijan. There were protests in 2019. And at the same time, he's under attack from nationalists who, are angry that, you're propagating all this Azeri nationalism, but there's been no success on the front. So, earlier this year, protesters stormed the Azeri parliament demanding war with Armenia. So Ilham Aliyev, from his perspective, war is, I would say, partially a tool of internal consolidation, about dealing with opposition and consolidating its nationalist base.
We should also talk about Turkey, right? Because they're the kind of big ally in the background for Azerbaijan.
Yeah, I mean, and Turkey. Think about the First World War situation with Austria and Germany. Turkey's kind of given, just as Germany gave Austria the blank check to go to war with Serbia, Turkey is given this kind of blank check for Azerbaijan. There's a lot of debate among specialists about who's really calling the shots. Is this Erdogan's project? Is this Aliyev's project? They both have reasons to want to escalate this conflict at this particular moment in time. So I don't think it's really helpful to say that Azerbaijan is a puppet of Turkey or Turkey is just doing Azerbaijan's bidding. But both leaders have, reasons to do with internal consolidation, to do with their foreign policy, to escalate this conflict at this time?
Yeah, so I want to get Danny in on this in a minute, but I do just want to say, right, since certainly as far as the way that a lot of Armenians and people from an Armenian background, in other countries perceive this, that the Turkey angle is big because, Turkey, in the early 20th century, literally committed genocide against Armenians. So there's a kind of narrative that you can tell here that ties this into that, right? Because Turkey is so important as a backer of Azerbaijan in this.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely agree that from the Armenian perspective, Turkey's involvement is seen as an extension of this early 20th century genocide and an extension of Turkish hostility towards Armenians. And it's important to remember that Armenians still live in Turkey. There's still an Armenian community, not so much in Anatolia anymore, still in Istanbul. One of the leading members of the HDP, the People's Democratic Party in Turkey, is an Armenian. And this community in Turkey is getting harassed now within this atmosphere. The Armenian Patriarchate is based there, that's being harassed, and Armenians living in Kurtulush, which is, people call it an Armenian district, but it's a district which is made up of middle-class people, which includes a lot of Armenians. The nationalists driving through there to intimidate people. So, it's a pretty terrifying experience for Armenians living in Turkey at the moment. And of course, the Armenian diaspora, as with many diasporas, is often more nationalist and more hardline than people living on the ground. So, of course, the sort of anti-Turkish and anti-Azerbaijani rhetoric and the notion that these Turks and Azeris are like savages and bloodthirsty Muslims and things like that, that is obviously feeding into this kind of like very unhelpful cycle of, discourse that's, dehumanizes the two sides.
Yeah. So when Gene was doing the historical backdrop earlier, he was talking about the way that the Soviet Union, under Stalin, tried to solve the national question there, and this is not the only case that happening, right? Probably made things worse, and so I guess part of why I was eager to have you be a part of this discussion, Daniel, is because you're is to kind of get a little bit of sort of big picture insight into the larger the larger thing that's going on with with some of this geopolitically, because in some ways, like, another sort of story that you can tell about this is that this is this is just more sort of fallout from this kind of post-Cold War, post-Soviet, like, ethnic conflicts, that would also be a story that would include Yugoslavia and things like that. But yeah, feel free to jump in and like kind of speak to any part of that you want to.
Sure. I mean, there's so many interesting things. When I think about the Soviet Union and the Azeris, for example, I think about how one could examine that from the perspective of how the Soviet Union tried to, blend communism with particular local customs of Islam. Or if you think about Nagorno-Karabakh, you think about the difficulty of just generally controlling mountainous regions. And mountainous regions, whether you're thinking about, Western Pakistan, Afghanistan, are so difficult to pacify. And so there's a lot of really interesting sort of ways you can approach this problem. So as someone who's not really a specialist on the Caucasus, but who is interested in the larger question of geopolitics, and Gene, feel free to jump in and tell me if I'm wrong. What's really interesting to me here is that how these how this conflict between our Armenians and the Azeris is basically reflective of these new constellations of geopolitical power that are just beginning to emerge in the last 5 or 6 years, where you have a United States that is clearly not going to act as it did in the 1990s as global policemen, or in the 2000s, 2010s as sort of this anti-terror state, allowing for these new constellations to emerge. So ones that emerged to me directly are China and Pakistan coming closer against India. You see India and Israel allying with each other. Now you see Turkey, in this instance, and the Russian Federation essentially fighting each other over, oil and gas energy resources that are going to be crucial to them in the coming years. And of course, Azerbaijan has basically, Baku in particular, has played this role in European geopolitics for a century. There's a very famous picture, I'm sure you all know of it, I think Hitler's birthday in 40 or 41, where he gets the cake with Baku centered in it, because this was the drive for the Caucasus that, basically engendered the invasion of the Soviet Union, was a drive for these oil resources. It's interesting to me, and Gene, as more of a specialist, I'm curious what you think, if this is related to the so-called neo-Ottomanist policy that Erdogan is, trying to pursue. He tried to do this kind of Islamic thing in the 2000s, but in the last 5 or 6 years, you see him reaching a rapprochement with Israel. You see him trying to sort of expand this influence in the former Islamic territory of the Ottoman Empire. So it's interesting to me, where as the United States, at least in a relative scale, retreats in some sense from the world, you get the emergence of these regional powers that I think are going to define at least the next 5-10 years of geopolitical conflict. Not to say that the Azeris or the Armenians are not, making use of these various sides for their own purposes, as is always done, but it seems like there's different levels going on here, and I'm particularly interested in sort of that Erdogan neo-Ottomanist element of it.
Yeah, I mean, Gene, in your Jacobin article, you talked about how there have been several areas, right, lately where Turkey has kind of had I think you used some phrase like great power pretensions lately.
Yeah, I mean, I think Turkey is an interesting part. I think that, Daniel's correct in pointing out, like as the United States takes a more hands-off approach around the world, this opens up space for places like Turkey. And because Turkey has a good relationship and is part of the Western alliance system, it facilitates their more aggressive foreign policy. Iran follows an aggressive foreign policy, but there's a lot more pushback because Iran is a kind of counter-hegemonic state that, Iran's foreign policy hasn't changed between the before and after the Iranian Revolution. It's always been to dominate the Gulf. The only difference is that under the Shah, they were doing it in cooperation with the United States, and now they're doing it in opposition to the United States. Turkey is an interesting case because despite Turkey, I'm very much, a lot of us, people who work in Ottoman studies and Turkish history, really hate the term neo-Ottomanism because it doesn't quite capture what's going on at the moment. The term neo-Ottomanism works, in a sense, for looking at Turkey's internal affairs as we see a shift away from the kind of secularism of Ataturk towards a new Turkish Islamic synthetic national identity, which focuses a lot more on the Ottoman past. But if you look at where Turkey's intervening, you can make a strong argument that Erdogan's trying to rebuild the Italian empire because he's intervening in Libya, Somalia, Albania, and places like that. And, historically, Azerbaijanis who are Shia, although Turkish, would have been sort of really an anathema to the Sunni Ottomans. So Erdogan is pursuing this very kind of novel foreign policy, which is opportunist to a certain extent, and which takes advantage of Turkey's the fact that Turkey has Europe over a barrel because they have the Syrian refugee flow, which means the ability of Europe to push back on any Turkish maneuvering is limited. Turkey is an American ally, so there's a lot Turkey can do that it can get away with that it wouldn't get away with. So it has this kind of interesting position where there's a lot of anti-American, anti-imperialist discourse in Turkey. But Turkey's ability to expand overseas is precisely because it's part of the Western system, and it's taking advantage of this in Azerbaijan, in Libya, and in Syria. These were all, facilitated by the United States or Russia to a certain degree. And as Turkey plays this more aggressive role, there are areas, for example, where they conflict with Russia, and areas where they can work with Russia. There are areas where they work with the United States. So it's kind of this trying to pursue a more independent nationalist foreign policy, which is framed to a certain degree in Islamic unity. There's a lot of Islamic discourse coming out, but in terms of Azerbaijan, is very much in pan-Turanist, Turkish nationalist framework as well. So I think it's an interest. I think seeing these new powers emerge is in an interesting dynamic.
Yeah, and you mentioned Russia a minute ago, and I guess we should probably dwell on that for a second, because we've talked a lot about the relationship between Turkey and Azerbaijan, but Armenia's big protector here is Russia, and I think something you said in the article is that it's possible that, from Putin's perspective, this is this is all a good thing, because it reminds the Armenians that they need him. For much of Armenia's post-independence history, just like Azerbaijan, it's dominated by these former apparatchiks guys. In fact, in Armenia, many of them have origins in Nagorno-Karabakh, so they're very kind of serious about Nagorno-Karabakh. But then in 2018, you had this Velvet Revolution, and that I think the Russians are very concerned about those kind of things. We saw what happened in Georgia.
Georgia
Example. So I think from Putin's perspective, letting Azerbaijan and Turkey, giving them a free hand to do this, helps keep the new administration, which has been moving against corruption to a certain degree, and doing this, that, making some changes. And I think that reminds them of the importance of the Russian connection. If you read the critiques coming out of Azerbaijan, they say Armenia is not a real country because it's basically just a Russian colony and does what Russia wants. Russia at the same time is playing both sides and using its position to have leverage on both sides. So using some leverage on the Armenians.
So what do you think? What is Erdogan's goal here? This is what I don't quite understand. I could see what the Azeris are trying to do, what the Armenians are going to do, and why Putin's trying to, the classic southern border issue that has bedeviled Russia for 500 years. But what is Erdogan's goal? This is what's the most interesting thing to me. I mean, there's obviously the pipeline, which is Turkey really wants, of course, but I just can't. His foreign policy seems to just lurch from strategy to strategy every 4 or 5 years. And as a Turkish specialist, since I have you on the line, what's he trying to do here?
I think we have to look at the different phases of the Erdogan administration, because earlier on during the Erdogan administration, it wasn't such a one-man show, right? There were multiple power centers. The foreign minister could conduct a foreign policy, and Davutoglu, who later became the prime minister, had this zero problems policy where he tried to use soft power and things like that. But increasingly, as Turkey has become a one-man show, where the presidency has been enhanced, foreign policy is a prestige issue, in my opinion. In some ways, is to do with consolidating Erdogan's power. From war abroad, for example, the invasion of Syria, right? The attack on the Kurds of Syria, that played a very good function in domestic affairs because it stops the consolidation of the opposition. The opposition is divided into pro-peace and Turkish nationalist factions. No rapprochement is possible while war is happening. With Azerbaijan, it's a win-win situation. For the price of selling the Azerbaijanis some drone technology and some airplanes, sending some Syrian mercenaries across there, Turkey is expanding its influence and probably making some money out of this at a tough time. So I think part of it's to do with domestic consolidation. Part of it, I think, has an economic imperative to it. A good example is Libya. Turkey, and I had a personal friend who did business in Libya. Before Gaddafi's fall, Turkey had a lot of interests in Libya, right? It's a place where Turkish businessmen would often head off to these like frontiers because it was a place where they could make money. So Turkey is trying to reestablish economic influence in those areas. In the Eastern Mediterranean, there's all these issues to do with natural gas as well. So beyond the kind of political aspects, there's economic aspects too.
So I have a question, just again as a non-specialist. So historians tell the stories like there's this Arab nationalist moment from, let's say, the 30s to the 70s, and there's this Islamic moment from the 70s forward that sort of replaces that Arab nationalism. I was just wondering, is there like an Islamic factor here where it's like Turkey versus Wahhabi of the Saudis or the Shias in Iran, and like we don't view it from that perspective because we're like Islam is not the hot thing of the day, but it just seems like one thing that I'm trying to get this macro historical trend is like, are we seeing something new in the so-called Islamic world that is being reflected in this struggle that is like this post Arab nationalism moment?
I mean, that's an interesting perspective. I think there certainly is a struggle for who is the leader of the Sunni world, traditionally we've looked at the struggle between Saudi Arabia and Egypt, right? Making its place. But I think Turkey under Erdogan is making, Turkey for much of its history orientated its foreign policy towards the West. But now Erdogan is making a play to be an important Middle Eastern and Islamic leader. And obviously there are like material reasons behind that. But at the same time, I think it's not so much as an ancient sectarian aspect to it, because Turkey maintains reasonable relations with Shia Iran, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it comes down to taking a leadership role in the kind of Middle Eastern sort of the Middle Eastern and Islamic region.
It seems more anti-Saudi to me than anything.
Yeah,
like that's how I would understand it. It's like they're orienting themselves towards the Saudis in some way in the last 5-10 years. I think Erdogan realized he would never be a full member of the EU. I remember in 2007, I met an EU vice president, and he's like, we're never letting Turkey in. They're never going to be a real thing. And I think he saw the writing on the wall correctly, frankly, and is now really in a really interesting way moved in this, like, oriented himself in a new way, which and the only reason I know about this is one of my students is writing on Turkey, right? Turkey-Israeli relations, and sort of Israel is this like key figure in how Erdogan imagines himself, I think.
Yeah, I think Israel is a really fascinating case because Turkey has historically had really great relations with Israel, and they were buying weapons off them and drones and things like that until relatively recently. Turkey's built its own drone industry now. But of course, it's a discursive
ISI.
level. Yeah, exactly. Well, I can't remember what the Turkish drone is called, but you can see pictures of them on Twitter. But they're very proud of this too. But I think, like Israel, Israel were the ones who caught Abdullah Öcalan, the leader of the PKK, in 1999. Israel has had strong security relations with the Turkish military establishment. But as this kind of independent military establishment has been like weakened, and then after the 2016 coup annihilated, Israel bashing is like a freebie, right? Israel's never going to do anything about it, and it's nothing beats a bit of anti-Semitism, to rile up the
street,
to rile up the street. And as Saudi Arabia moves away, Saudi Arabia and Egypt move away from even pretending to care about the Palestinians, this leaves an opportunity for Erdogan to kind of reimagine himself as like this protector of the Palestinians, this supporter of. I mean, he used the term "our town" to refer to Jerusalem. Now, I don't think he meant our town as in a town of Turkey, but more of in a kind of spiritual sense. But obviously, that discourse is pretty inflammatory. So I think Erdogan is using cultural issues, just like any right-wing politician does, to enhance their political and material interest.
Makes sense. So I did want to get at a couple questions from chat. 49 Hamburger asks, and maybe throw this one to Daniel. How does the USA handle having multiple hegemons in the Middle East as the USA's soft power has less and less effect on the region?
Yeah, good question. I mean, how would I handle it? I don't think the best Middle Eastern policy is an alternative energy policy in the United States,
Right.
as far as I'm concerned. Leave the region, let people work it out. So the question is, what is a Biden administration going to do, or a Trump administration going to do? I mean, I think Trump will continue to show a general disinterest in the region, and I imagine, particularly in the Caucasus, and I imagine that's going to be relatively true of the Biden administration as well. I think a Biden administration, you're going to see basically a slight drawing down in the Middle East and a buffeting up of tensions with China. I think that's almost certainly going to be the main thing that you'll see. And by tensions, I mostly mean rhetorical tensions, because I don't see how the United States and China are going to possibly disentangle their entirely imbricated economies in any meaningful way. So I just think the United States is going to take a back seat to this. Gene, are they selling weapons to both sides right now? I've seen different things.
China?
No, the U.S.
That's a good question. I don't think. I mean, like, I don't know, to be honest. So
yeah, no one knows really. So this is the question.
But I don't think they're a particularly important player, because, you know, the Azerbaijani army and the Armenians, they rely on Soviet equipment. I know the Israelis are selling equipment to. There might be some stuff that they're selling. The Azeris have spent a hell of a lot of money on lobbying in the United States.
Right.
I mean, there was a great article in Foreign Policy which talked about all the lobbying that's been done, a lot of slush funds. And I don't know if this is true, but one of my former students is a legislative assistant in Jefferson City. And he told me, and again, I don't know if this is true, apparently 18 state legislatures recognized that one of the massacres of Azerbaijanis as like a day of mourning, which I found, you know, I don't know if it's true, but it's, you know, it sounds the kind of thing that a lobbying group might do, just get these random state legislatures to like recognize a massacre and things like that. So, you know, there are definitely some connections there, but I'm not sure about the weaponry issue. I think it's mainly Soviet equipment.
So I thank you. I was just curious about that, because I've seen different things.
There's a question earlier about Israeli involvement. So that actually, maybe dwell on that for a second. So the Israelis have been selling weapons to, this would be Armenia?
No, to Azerbaijan.
Oh, Azerbaijan. Okay, interesting.
Yeah, Azerbaijan has tried to sell itself as being like a moderate Muslim power that's like pro-Israel. So Israel has so it's a weird case. Whereas Israel and Turkey are like butting heads in some places.
That surprised me.
On Azerbaijan. I was surprised when I read this, but there's been actually the Israeli government has been criticized within the Israeli press as well about this. So, I mean, I don't know the ins and outs of it, but yes, as far as I know, and this comes from Israeli sources, there have been, you know, there's these weapon sales, and obviously Armenia is not very happy about it.
And just one thing, Ben, I wanted to add, I think, to the question: how does the U.S. deal with these rising powers? Is, I think, kind of the question of foreign policy. So I think there's two major questions of foreign policy, let's say in the next generation, 20 years. The first one is the more important one to me, which is, how do you deal with climate change and truly transnational issues like refugee flow? We're going through an enormous era of population movement, which is, you know, something we haven't seen since World War II, and probably on a greater scale than World War II for a lot of different reasons. So how do you deal with transnational problems like that? And then also, how do you deal not with great power competition, which I think is going to remain relatively status quo, but what do you do with the rise of the so-called, what used to be called in the 19th century, middle powers like Turkey, middle powers like India, you know, who are going to be thorns in the side, Turkey and Russia, or even though they get along, or Turkey and Europe, or, you know, India and China. I think that is really a major geopolitical question. And I think that, you know, the left, as many things in foreign policy, it doesn't really have a good answer for it. So it'll be interesting to see, you know, as more and more people go into these issues, how that's going to get worked out, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess also, Well, actually, sorry. So one quick off-topic thing, just while I'm thinking about it, and then we'll get back on. Since you were saying in your answer to the first part of the question that you think that under a Biden administration, there would be escalated rhetorical tensions with China, but that'll be about it. So just for fun, if I mean, I know right now Biden is further ahead in the polls than Hillary was, and etc. Right, but take the 5% or whatever chance that Trump manages to either win an electoral college victory straight out, or manages to, whatever, you can fill in the nightmare details of whatever post-election scenario there might be, and so we actually do get a second Trump term. Do you think that in that case the U.S. tensions with China stay rhetorical, or that something beyond that happens?
Well, the question is, what would beyond it? So Trump did have a trade war. That was a real thing that really did affect certain industries. I don't think the Chinese particularly appreciate, the Wuhan virus, Chinese virus thing. But I mean, I just think China has a wise foreign policy from its perspective when it's dealing with the U.S. I think it has three major goals, from what I can tell. One, it wants to get out under the thumb of the dollar. In the long term, that is like a major goal. Two, it wants to get out under any potential, and it's already kind of done this, influence of international institutions that are essentially Western governed, which is creating this sort of alternative institutional structure, which it has already done. And third, I think it wants to provide itself guaranteed access to particular raw materials throughout, the world that has been traditionally North Atlantic dominated. I don't think China has any designs on global hegemony in the way that the U.S. was able to achieve global hegemony after World War II. I think it has designs on regional hegemony and will likely be checked by a coalition that includes India and basically the U.S. allies now. And so I think that is what it's going to do and what it is going to achieve. So I think then another issue, and Gene and Ben, feel free to disagree with me, is like an intellectual problem. I don't think we're anywhere near the material realities where this would be a real live issue. Is like, is there a way to create a more legitimate international institutional structure that is able to not really deploy force? I just don't see how that's really going to happen, but to coordinate true responses to things like climate change when countries like India and China are at an earlier stage of development, to use the stages terms no one likes anymore. And so I think these are the issues that are going to confront it. But I personally don't think in 50 years the United States will be the hegemon in East Asia.
Yeah, well, I'll let Gene give a more in-depth answer. I guess all I really have to say about the international institutions thing is, God, I hope so, right? Because it's really hard.
This is the big issue. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really, really difficult issue for 1,000 different reasons, and I think a lot of people anti-imperialists have semi-punted on it because the current ones are so illegitimate and so clearly like a velvet glove over the dominance of the North Atlantic. But I mean, I just don't see a way out of some sort of international institution as a means to global coordination. But I have no idea how one gets there in a real way.
That's what I wanted to ask you, Daniel, is this comes down to sort of the intellectual projects of the left on how to build any kind of alternative. Because it strikes me when I listen to, discussions on foreign policy, we're either at the only solution is sort of international proletarian revolution, right?
Good luck. Yeah.
And then there's nothing between that and, like liberal interventionism. You have, right. You have like a whole, the question would come, and this was raised by one of my colleagues, Kuba, who works at he works in the military-industrial complex a little bit. Has a little bit of insight. It's like the problem is that and he was a big Bernie fan, was like, if Bernie Sanders had become president, who's going to staff his foreign ministry? Who's going to security apparatus of everything? And his point is we need international institutions. We need Mongolia should have the space mining institute, and Iceland should be the internet police. We need those kind of things. But and this is not my idea, but this was the point raised by Kuba, was we just don't have any cadre who are thinking on what if a social democrat or a democratic socialist becomes president, who the hell's going to staff everything? There's
So
not
I,
Daniel Bessner's out there.
So I've been writing and thinking about this for years because my academic work was on the rise of think tanks, and they were actually incredibly effective in getting particular ideas into the institutions. So I think this is a real problem, and I think this is one of the issues. Bernie, as I view it, was a Hail Mary pass that was essentially going to try to subvent decades of left organic organizing by winning. And so one of the problems that should he have won was precisely who would be on that NSC, who would be on that Department of State, who would be on that DOD, and I got to tell you, it was going to be my guess is it would have been Obama administration veterans. I actually advised the Bernie campaign, and one of the main thing that I stressed, like if there was like a unifying theme, it was like you had to get like the task force, like the United States, a Bernie administration needed to come in and start by basically having a series of task forces just to literally analyze the incredibly complex structure of how power actually works in the United States and the choke points where, there's 40 people who are like left-wing foreign policy people where you would actually put them to ensure that, the Ben Rhodeses of the world don't dominate foreign policy or whomever it may be, but it's a real issue. You're getting a little of it with the Quincy Institute, but the Quincy Institute is very consciously not left wing; it's restraint, and that's a different thing. So I think you're gonna. It's a years long project, but I do think there's a lot of millennials and younger who grew up in the wake of Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, blah blah blah, who are ready to do this.
Yeah, I mean it's a problem in general, right? I mean, like the only God, I mean, like you start thinking about left-wing think tanks on anything, right? Like even the stuff that the left has plausible things to say about and likes to talk about all the time, in terms of domestic policy. It's like, okay, there's like the People's Policy Project, which is basically one guy, Matt Brunig, doing some crowdfunding, and like he'll give people. Anyway, it's a very that's kind of where we're at, and it's particularly a problem for the foreign policy stuff and that sort of hypothetical where Bernie had won or whatever.
It's also a problem.
Rashida Tlaib becomes president in 2028 or whatever, because if we don't even conceptually have a good answer to Gene's question, what's the midpoint between just sort of hoping for international proletarian revolution to make it all go away and defaulting to liberal interventionism, and then the only people you could even hire for the foreign policy shop for a Bernie administration would be old Obama people, then that sounds to me like a hypothetical Sanders administration that would have ended up defaulting to liberal interventionism.
Especially the question is, if Bernie was like that first year, I'm going to spend all my political capital on going after the military industrial complex, I just don't think he would have done that. I think he would have done M4A and something else. But I mean, this is what I've been trying to build out myself intellectually in the last few years, these sorts of questions. And they're really difficult, particularly in foreign policy, because it's so elite driven. It's so driven by literally, there's not that many people in what I call the military intellectual complex, the people who create the ideas of American empire. They all go to the same schools. There's a class bias toward all of these institutions, which makes it even more difficult than in an area like, let's say, M4A, where you could rise through the ranks of different professions to become a policy person eventually. In the foreign policy establishment, generally, because you're not fighting a war after the all-volunteer force, you got this position because you went to Princeton, or something along those lines. So there's this class bias that is very difficult to overcome.
And I would note the only people who do come from outside of that circle are people who go through the military route. So that, the only outside blood that comes in is people who are deeply invested in the military. So, I mean, I think this is a bigger problem with elite institutions in general and how they monopolize, these positions. And as Daniel says, it's you end up knowing loads of people who are if you go to one of these institutions, you don't get a job because you did well at school. You get a job because you smoked weed with someone's son and helped him avoid going to prison or something like that, or you were just a buddy and things like that. So I think the foreign policy establishment there are people in DC think tanks who at least in Turkish affairs, who I rate as pretty good and who are pretty skeptical, but on an organizational basis, because the left doesn't have any money, and the money it has, it's not going to spend it on the left-wing foreign policy think tank, it's going to be on something to do with Medicare. Like, foreign policy is so far down the list.
So far down.
So far down the list of priorities, like people, but it's like, and I too wrestle with this, because it's like, you anytime you try and articulate, okay, let's do a foreign policy, people on the left are like, well, you're like a sellout to imperialism. It's like, okay, if you take over the American empire, what are you going to do?
So listen to this, Gene and Ben. You'll like this story. An unnamed popular left-wing press approached me about writing a book on left-wing foreign policy. So I did a proposal, and it was essentially that intermediate realm that Gene was talking about. The proposal was turned down because they wanted me to look at what Cuba and Vietnam were doing and take inspiration. And so to me, this is just like, what world are we living in? A social democrat, the head of the fucking most powerful empire in human history. I'm sorry, Vietnamese foreign policy doesn't really have that much to say to that. We're charting a new path, and maybe there'd be inspiration or whatever, blah, blah, blah. But this is like a different thing. So I think we on the left, ultimately, some reason we don't even want to think about it, because power, actually manipulating foreign policy power, is going to be very ethically compromising. There are only bad options.
No, for sure. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, Ben, and you're the ethics guy, so you know better than I.
Well, no, I mean, I was going to say, right? I mean, I think I don't know that much. I know much less about the Vietnamese case. I think Cuban foreign policy, is very inspiring, in many ways, right? I mean, like, nothing brings out my my inner tanky like, thinking about Cuba sending doctors around the world, and for that matter, I mean, as far as use of force, helping to defeat apartheid, in Angola, but right, that's clearly just an entirely different. Like, I think that's like, I think Cuba probably does about as well as an isolated and impoverished third world country possibly could in its interventions in the world, but that's just a very, very, very different project than trying to figure out what transitioning the U.S. to some sort of like more robustly post-imperial foreign policy looks like, especially if our purpose isn't just to wind down the empire, although of course that should be, that should be a big part of it, and arguably, right, I mean, it shouldn't be so far down our list, because this is, winding down the empire is the most useful thing the left could, the American left could contribute to the rest of the world. But that's also not our only project. I mean, if we actually took power, one thing that we'd want to do, for example, is to guarantee that, like, life would continue to exist on Earth, ideally, which I'm being like slightly hyperbolic, but I mean, even if that wasn't exactly what was at stake, right? Like we are facing climate catastrophe, and it is very hard to see how that gets solved without some sort of robust international, institutions. Like I just don't see, I just don't see a scenario where, like, every country just sort of independently does its own little Green New Deal, and that's enough.
And then you get into questions like, what if Saudi or Israel had, like, what role do they play? And these are not great questions. These are not, I don't like any of the answers to any of these things, but I just
no, for sure. And also, for that matter, on the subject of international institutions, right? I mean, like, you can be, in a sense, robustly anti-interventionist, but when we think, for example, about something like the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict right now, it would be good if there was at least something that could be done to at least, pressure the sides into some sort of negotiation. I mean, I often think, you were talking about ethics earlier, that I'm writing this book about Christopher Hitchens, and I think about Hitchens in the last decade, when he started taking all of the bad foreign policy positions, I would like to, I would like to have something to say to, like, 2005 Hitchens, when he said, like, oh, hey, you're anti-war, then, hey, you're just like selling out Iraqi Kurds, for example, right? And I think that the answer certainly shouldn't be to say that, he was right. I mean, I think that his positions on all that stuff were a moral and political disaster. But I think we do need a better answer than just saying, oh well. I guess, like, we'll roll the dice that, like, the utilitarian calculation, will, like, that nothing will be better than this.
Yeah, and this is why I was like the task force guy. I'm like, task force on bases, task force on budget, task force on the NSC, because we don't even have answers, and I'll stop after this, but I think it's really critical, because when you look at, like, what the progressive movement did well, is that they had 40 years to prepare for the New Deal. They had a million plans, so when FDR finally won the election, he was able to choose. And I worry that we don't have that in foreign policy. And I think that's what we should do now, particularly because it's likely a real lefty won't be in until President Ocasio-Cortez and whatever it may be.
Yeah. Well, if you can't get, if unnamed popular press won't do it, you should still write that. You should still write that anyway. If worst case scenario, I'm sure Doug would take it for zero. But I think it's a very necessary book. But I do want to get a couple questions from chat before we wrap up that are more nuts and bolts things about the immediate subject. So actually, I'll just do two and then throw these to Gene. So one of them was, do you think Azerbaijan is holding off on attacking Armenia proper directly? They have on the borders to not get Russia involved, or are they not thinking that far ahead? And then the other one was from Ali Kasagam. Is there any proof to the Turkish claim regarding PKK fighters?
Yeah. So on the first front, there was some discussion, in Armenia about whether Azerbaijan's attack triggered the military treaty. And Putin was pretty clear that because Nagorno-Karabakh is not recognized as part of Armenia, this doesn't count as an attack on Armenia. But obviously, an attack on Armenia proper could Putin's words, which are, like obscure and mercurial as usual, could be a warning to say, don't escalate this war too much, otherwise we will have to get involved. But the other factor is that it's nearly winter, and nobody wants to fight a war in the winter. So my suspicion would be, there's going to be this process over the winter, and this is just my guess, like I may be totally wrong, where, like, fighting is a little bit sporadic. There's a bit of on and off fighting, but basically nobody can really do anything because it's too cold. And so it's just a restock and rearm period. And we may see a resumption of this conflict once, the thaw comes down. So, yeah, I think, like, one of the reasons that this is not escalating, like, faster is, like, weather. On the PKK question, this is actually pretty funny, because I saw that there was a tweet from Azerbaijani intelligence, which was, like, a recording of supposedly PKK fighters doing a, like, on the comms, right? And, like, it was, like, you don't have to be, like, a super intelligent, like, military expert to know that it was fake. Number one, the communications were in Sorani Kurdish, which is the dialect spoken in Iraqi Kurdistan. And, like, there are obviously Iraqi Kurds in the PKK, but they're, like, a very small minority. And the main, so, like, it's really weird that you would have them speaking in that particular dialect of Kurdish. And you'd only pick that up if you know a bit about Kurds. The second thing is the PKK does most of its communications in Turkish. So, like, why are they doing communications in like Iraqi Kurdish dialect when the PKK's, like, general military language is Turkish? Because, lots of Kurds in Turkey don't speak Kurdish. They've been assimilated, so they use Turkish. And thirdly, like, the guys on the thing are, like, saying the most dumb stuff, like, hello, comrade, this is me on the phone. Hey, comrade. So it's like, I don't know if it was like really bad fake Turkish intelligence or the PKK made it to make the Azerbaijani intelligence service look stupid. But like there's been rumors. Like I'm super skeptical that anyone from the PKK is like heading all the way around to get to Armenia to go fight Turks. There are Turkish military operations in Syria and Iraq. If they want to fight the Turks, they'll fight them there.
Makes sense. One from Shinobu Sensui, punt this over to Danny, says, is establishing a cross-ideological coalition to scale back U.S. military interventions a realistic possibility, for example, among leftists and libertarians?
It's already happening now in the Quincy Institute, which I would say is, it's hard to put a percentage, but I would say has more of a left bent than not. But there's also a few libertarians, and it's funded by Soros and Charles Koch. So this is where you get into the nitty. And Ben, I'd love to do a political ethics podcast with you, because it would be really interesting. Because this is like, where you're taking Charles Koch's money.
Right.
And someone who you might not agree with about many other things, or you're taking George Soros's money, someone who George Soros was very into the responsibility to protect for many years. And so it's a really interesting question. And I think there's sophisticated thinking to be done. I mean, because you don't want to, on one hand, like, obviously, of course, we live in the world. And of course, you make these sorts of strange bedfellows alignments. But then again, look what happened to the SPD in Weimar. Right, where you have this like very strange, you're allying with like the nationalist conservatives against the communists, which is also not totally the SPD's fault, but whatever it may be. But these are really difficult questions. But I think the answer is yes, of course, but then think seriously and hard about the actual stakes and ethics and realities that lead to.
Yeah, just to be clear, if anybody got confused about this, the official GTAA position is that allying with the Freikorps and murdering Rosa Luxemburg was bad.
Right, exactly, right. So this is what but that founds the Republic and the SPDs. I mean, so this is, they're like, we're either going to get monarchy or we're going to ally, and that was a terrible move, actually. But there are ones later on in the 20s that were like more questionable.
Yeah, no, I mean, for sure. And look, I mean, I think that I guess I already said something like a little Stalinist earlier, so I'll do another one and say that doing the opposite, right? Having incredibly broad popular front coalitions to stop fascism was probably the right move, because it's better that we're not living under fascism. But yeah, sorry, G, do you want to jump in on this? Or
yeah, I mean, I think one of the important things is that we shouldn't fetishize alliances with elements on the right. I think for some people on the left, it becomes like a point of principle. Like there's this kind of, we're all just populists against the system. I think it's really critical that we deal with things on an issue by issue basis. So like. Anyone like what's his name? That dude on the Rising, Saga, whatever his name is.
Yeah.
He can say stuff which is like, yeah, that's a good critique, but like the critique is not the sandwich. We need to like know what the solution is. So if we have hey, we don't want to sell weapons to Azerbaijan, right, or anymore, and the libertarians are like, yeah, we're going to support that legislation. That's great. We'll do that, right? That's fine. But I think this fetishization of like let's work together, because it's a good thing to do per se, is I think can be a little bit of a silly path to go down.
No, right. So actually, it's kind of funny you use that example. I was on Rising this morning, and at the end, I invited Sagar to come on the show sometime, and if he takes me up on it, right, that is exactly the point that I'd push. It's actually the point I did push in the last episode when I was interviewing his co-host Crystal, which is that I think that it's very easy to say, hey, here are all the things that are bad, but then you say, like, you can, Tucker Carlson, right, can sort of score some populist points, by talking about how it's bad that people are paid so little and they don't have health care, but then somehow he doesn't actually support $15 an hour or Medicare for all. And I think that those sorts of really basic questions, right, it's like, okay, well, are you going to become a leftist, basically, by actually embracing those solutions, or is there some market solution that would be okay with your conservative principles? If so, what is it? And then let's argue about that, right? I think rather than either fetishizing the cross ideological agreement or sort of reacting to any engagement, with anybody on the right, like Dracula reacting to the cross. I think that just sort of having that grounded, like I loved it actually when Red Scare had Bannon on, because they asked him that flat out, right? If you're such a populist, why don't you support Medicare for all? And he so manifestly didn't have a good answer. I think on the foreign policy thing, I mean, I think in a sense it's different, in a sense it's not. That the sense in which it's not is what we've been talking about, right? That you do need international institutions, deal with things like climate change to, one hopes, find some non-interventionist way of calming down flare-ups like Armenia, Azerbaijan. But the sense in which it is different is that part of the solution really is just not non-interventionism, at least if what we mean by intervention is like war intervention. And I think that something I've heard Daniel talk about before is that we can separate out somewhat, or it might be useful for a future left government to separate out some the governmental aspect of approach to some of these things to the civil society, international solidarity approach side of it, right? Because we do, look, I mean, it's not a left-wing position to just be indifferent to the working class somewhere else in the world being crushed, by some despotic regime. But that doesn't mean that we have to have interventionist solutions. The left movement can hold power governmentally, but also have a grassroots that's doing civil society stuff to try to help people in civil societies in those countries.
Yeah, and that's why it's useful to think in terms of movement, which movements have different legs, so one might be the socialist element of the Democratic Party. Another one might be labor unions that are actually socialist. Another one might be avowedly socialist independent organizations, all of which are part of the democratic socialist movement. And different people have different roles to play in different sort of spaces at different times. And that's just thinking creatively and seriously about politics qua politics, which is something we're just starting to do in the last 5-6 years on the so-called, rising left.
Yeah, makes sense to me. So since we do have to wrap up in just a minute, I do want to do the big thing that I think we haven't talked about today, just for a couple minutes at the end, which is what is to be done, right? So you said earlier, Gene, that part of the frustration on the Azerbaijani side is the lack of resolution. I mean, in some ways, that's less of a frustration for the Armenians because the de facto resolution favors them. And there was a good question actually earlier that I didn't get to then because I wanted to come back to it now, which is somebody who I think maybe picked up on something you'd said about things being unresolved and said, isn't it better to resolve issues rather than compromise without closure, right? So of course, closure is good, but I mean, surely the only possible way out of this does involve compromise and some sort of negotiated long-term solution.
I mean, yeah, I think, and obviously, I'm not an Armenian or an Azerbaijani, so in a certain way, I don't really have a right to say like what the solution should be. But it strikes me the ultimate solution, if there is to be one, is actually Nagorno-Karabakh, which has boundaries as a former Soviet district, becomes part of Armenia, and Armenia evacuates from the lowlands around Nagorno-Karabakh, the lowland Karabakh, and returns those territories to Azerbaijan. And, you know, the Armenians can maintain a land, some kind of link to Nagorno-Karabakh. And in return, the Armenians guarantee some link to Nakhchivan, which is a Azerbaijani exclave located on the sort of south side of Armenia. I think, you know, this has been the offer that's kind of on the table. And I ultimately think that's the only thing that's really practical. Azerbaijan wanting all the territory back. You know, the Armenians who make 95% of the Karabakh population aren't going to go for it. Not until we have a real process of like people getting to know each other, people reconciling with each other, can we contemplate anything like that. So I think it's going to have to be, you know, refugee return, the return of occupied territories outside Nagorno-Karabakh to Azerbaijan, and then self-determination for the people of Nagorno-Karabakh, which will evidently lead them to become part of Armenia. But, you know, the question is, how do we get there?
All right, I guess we will unfortunately probably have to leave off on not having a good answer, maybe to that question. So thank both of you guys for coming. This yeah, I know I learned a lot. This has been really good, and let's do this again very soon.
Yeah, great seeing you guys. Talk to you soon.